Our speaker, Jack Santos, really moved to the area only in 2010. He has a degree in philosophy from Trinity College, a graduate degree from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and has spent his career in technology. He is probably most known locally as having been for several years president of the Maritime Society, the Custom House Museum, downtown in Newburyport, and worked and led them into doing some really creative and groundbreaking things over the last few years. As I said, he moved to Newburyport in 2010, and therein lies the beginning of today's story, which, as you know, he's going to talk about Arnold's invasion of Quebec, which is coming up on its 250th anniversary. And the only hint that I'll give you is he actually retraced the route that the invasion took in 2016 with his wife. So, Jack.
Thank you.
Look forward to it.
And I think John Pramberg deserves a round of applause as the outgoing president. So let's. I'm Jack Santos. I'll kind of keep you entertained for the next hour or so and tell you a little bit about what I did a few years ago with my wife up in the Maine North Woods, and tie it to Benedict Arnold's expedition to Quebec. Now, Alexander Hamilton wasn't there. Aaron Burr was. He was a private in the Army with Benedict Arnold, so he didn't really have a major role, but he did have a fairly significant role or tryst, which we'll talk about when we get to that point in the presentation. Just a warning, this presentation is part history, maybe sometimes a little embellishment. It's part travelogue. I'm hoping you'll get excited about what I tell you here today and maybe do the trip yourself as well. And it's also part genealogy, because I know that's core to the sons and daughters of the first settlers of Newbury. I would like to thank John and as well as Jeff Hansen and Jim Smith and all the rest of the officers and directors of the sons and daughters of the first settlers of Newbury for inviting me, because this really is an honor to be here today. So we're going to talk about Arnold's army, Benedict Arnold and the men of Newbury. And we're following their footsteps in their words this morning. So it's going to be really interesting. Some of you in the audience may have more to add. Just raise your hand if there's a little tidbit of information you'd like to include. We've already encountered some in the hallway in some of our conversations. More than happy, because I'm not the only history buff here, I think, in the room. And this is our hero today, Benedict Arnold. He was pretty young at the time that he took the reins of that expedition through the Maine North Woods. And there were 29 people from Newbury and Newburyport involved. So it's kind of an integral part of our history locally. Much of what you'll hear about this morning came out of diaries. This has got to be an Army expedition like no other, where so much was documented in individual diaries. Most of them now are in the public domain and online, so you can read through them yourselves. The diaries of Jonathan Meigs, Benedict Arnold himself, Caleb Haskell, Dr. Isaac Center, Samuel Spring, Ebenezer Wild, Captain Henry Dearborn, and many, many more. And on the table in front at the end of the presentation, there will be links to an online website that you'll have access to, where there will be this presentation as well as some of the research material that I use. Now, Benedict had met with George Washington in Cambridge right after the Battle of Bunker Hill. And they were kind of planning, okay, what do we do next? The war is on. And Washington, Benedict Arnold, as well as Philip Schuyler, General Philip Schuyler out of New York, another connection to Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton married General Schuyler's daughter, and General Richard Montgomery, and they all said, well, we got to do something bold. We got to do something drastic. We need to go from 13 colonies to 14 colonies. Let's invade Canada. And that's what they decided to do right after Bunker Hill. And it's probably not a bad plan, because had that worked, oh my gosh, the war would have been over before it even started. Because everybody would have bet that the British would have just said, this is too much trouble, we're out of here. So it was a good plan. Colonel Arnold, all the others were generals. That tells you a little bit of a foreshadowing of his bitterness. Was a rising star, and the plan was for Arnold to attack through Maine, and General Schuyler, and then Schuyler got sick, couldn't do it. Richard Montgomery took over, would come up through Montreal. A little bit of background, most of Schuyler, Arnold, and a few others that were involved in this campaign had taken over Fort Ticonderoga. They had beaten the British back there, so that was their launching point. Ticonderoga was also the launching point for Henry Knox and all his cannons to come down to Boston. That later in 1776 would result in the British evacuation of Boston, because those cannons convinced them that maybe it wasn't a friendly place to stay. So there's the route. It was in 2016 that my wife and I decided, let's follow the Army's route. And we put our kayaks in our car, our bikes on the back. We decided we would be camping and stopping along the way at significant places. Not only did we stop, we pulled out the diaries and read the diary entries at the places that they were written. So it made it much more interesting and just heartfelt as we took this expedition through the north of Maine. So we basically, the route they took and would be to leave Newburyport by sea, go up the Kennebec River, up past Gardner and Augusta, through the backwoods of Maine, out through the Height of Land, which is the Canadian border, and then down the Chaudière River to Point Levé, just across the St. Lawrence Seaway to Quebec. That's the route that we followed almost exactly. We didn't take the sea route. We drove up 95, made it so much more easier. But our intent was to follow it as closely as possible, and at certain points, take the kayaks out and go up the rivers that they went up as well. Why me and why now? Well, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Arnold expedition, and so saw that kind of on the horizon at that time. I said, let's find out a little bit more about what was going on and see if we can discover some things for ourselves. I am also not a descendant of a first settler like many of you, but I do live in this house on Spring Street in the center of town. And as I did the research on the house, I discovered that it was pretty significant. Built between 1786 and 1789 by Samuel Noyce, who eventually moved up to Compton, New Hampshire to farm. And but when he sold it, when he built it to what I consider his first occupant, Abraham Wheelwright. And Abraham was the Wheelwright family was pretty significant. He was a descendant, probably the great-great-grandson of John Wheelwright, who was married to Anne Hutchinson's sister, Mary Hutchinson. That is a whole presentation in and of itself, so we won't get into the details here. And Abraham's father was Jeremiah Wheelwright, who is also involved in our story today. Abraham was 18 years old at the time of the Revolution. Jeremiah was 43 years old. And I've got this picture of Abraham and Jeremiah talking about what's going on and the kind of political mayhem that was happening at the time. And Abraham and Jeremiah, father and son, said, we are all in. we want to be independent from the British. Abraham joined the army of George Washington and headed south. He was involved in the evacuation of Boston, digging ditches in Dorchester for those cannons for Fort Ticonderoga, fought in the Battle of New York of Long Island, Brooklyn, and then crossed the Delaware with Washington and was involved in the Battle of Trenton. Jeremiah, on the other hand, decided to go north, and he joined the army with Benedict Arnold. So it's just kind of a compelling story of what those two did and the kind of commitment that our ancestors made to this new country. Jeremiah Wheelwright, I say he's from Newbury. He was actually born in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He was a school teacher in Ipswich. He was a commissary in the expedition. He was assistant to Joseph Farnwell. But he wasn't in the army. He was a civilian. He was 43 years old, which was very old for somebody to be involved in something like this at that time. As a civilian, that had significant implications for Jeremiah, and just reflected his commitment to this battle. If you're an army officer in those days and you were captured, generally there was a kind of a deference made to officers, and they would be released to the other side with the understanding, with kind of a wink, you won't fight again. Right? If you were an enlisted man and you were captured, you would have thrown in the brig, kind of held in captivity, and often traded for other enlisted men so that there would be some trading of soldiers between the side. If you were a civilian, you would be put to death if you were captured, because then you were considered a traitor. So now he's making a fairly significant commitment as a civilian on this expedition with Benedict Arnold. His aunt is Esther Wheelwright. Is anybody familiar with the name Esther Wheelwright? No. She's going to play kind of a backstory role in this. She was captured by Native Americans in Wells Bay and held as a captive, and we'll get into that as we move along. Caleb Haskell is our most significant figure in this story. Caleb was from Newbury or Newburyport. I love to hear the fifer music as we were kind of coming into the building today, because he was the fifer in Ezra Hunt's company under Moses Little regiment, and fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill. But then when this plot came up after Bunker Hill, he joined Samuel Ward's company for the Quebec Expedition, and joined the group in Benedict Arnold's group to take on Quebec. Now, all of you locals and some of you visitors may be familiar with that monument on the Upper Green. Everybody's driven by it at one time or another, and that reflects a campground that happened in 1775 when the soldiers left Cambridge with Benedict Arnold and marched up through all the neighboring towns and camped on the Upper Green. It wasn't just the Upper Green that those 1,100 soldiers, eventually they picked up men as they moved up through the towns of the Danvers and others, but they also camped out in the Mall, in the area around the Mall, in the area around Spencer Pierce Little Farm, and in the area around what is today known as Cashman Park. But the significant part of the Upper Green campsite was where it was predominantly Morgan's riflemen from Virginia. 96 men that came up from Virginia sharpshooters that had joined the expedition, camped out on the Upper Green. And there's the monument that describes the whole campsite. It wasn't specifically on the green. It was probably closer to Spencer Pierce Little Farm, across Route 1A, but it was in that general area. Now, if we see, we knew they were coming, and if you go down to the Archival Center in the Newburyport Public Library, you'll see they hold a complete set of the letters of the committees of correspondence here in Newburyport. That's fascinating, extremely valuable. It's digitized, so you're welcome to go to a library and review them and look at them. I did to see what exactly they were saying about these troops coming up with Benedict Arnold. It was going to be a major meeting place because they had to get on, depending on who you're talking to, 10 or 11 ships. Some diaries said 10, some diaries said 11. We'll explain why there's that discrepancy in a moment. But as we look at the committees of correspondence letter, I'll try to get this to work again. And the pointer is not working, but that's okay. It is. I just have to hold it down longer. Okay. As we're looking at this, I know we had a discussion at one of the tables about reading script. See if I can read this script. Noted that this committee will act upon a letter received from Colonel Arnold desiring them to prohibit the taverns from selling spirituous liquors to the soldiers under his command. Note that it be recommended that all inn holders in this town do desist from selling any spirituous liquors whatever to the soldiers. Voted that it is recommended to all retailers of spirituous liquors to desist from selling any liquors to any person until further order from this committee. So they weren't exactly totally looking forward to all these soldiers coming forward, and they wanted to keep booze out of their hands because they knew soldiers and booze don't mix. So it be that there was no liquor sold while the soldiers were here. And now, in 1975, was anybody involved in the 1975 celebrations? Don't be shy. Okay, there was none of us here. 1975, we had a big party in town over at the Arnold Expedition. Everybody dressed up. There were parades, there were speeches. We're hoping to recreate a bit of that in 2025, next year in September, so that we can celebrate and recognize how important that this event was locally. And Sherry Larson is involved in a small group of us that are trying to get some excitement around it, get some funding. We already have things planned, like a recreation of the send-off that happened in Old South Church, possibly a parade or march down to the water, maybe an encampment by Revolutionary War soldiers, and possibly a privateer or sailing ship. Dr. Maharman will be open for tours. So watch for that as those things develop. And if you're interested in helping out, let me know, or sure, and we'll get you involved with the group. The two museums are also involved in that. So the Museum of Old Newbury will have exhibits or something to show in terms of what happened at that time, as will the Custom House and Maritime Museum. The soldiers' visit to Newburyport kind of centered around Old South Church, as well as the Dalton House and the Tracy House. They figured prominently. Dinners, meetings, gatherings. Well, don't let me tell you about it. Let's have Caleb Haskell tell you about it. Sunday, September 17th, attended public worship, heard the Reverend Mr. Spring, our chaplain. Monday, September 18th, this afternoon we embarked on board the transports. We had 1,100 men and 11 transports. Tuesday, September 19th, this day, about 9 o'clock, we weighed our anchors. And so they left. Now, just one word about Samuel Spring. Reverend Samuel Spring came to us from Tewksbury, And later, after the war, he came back to Newburyport, and for many years, I think about 40 years, he was the pastor at the North Congregational Church on Titcomb Street, Titcomb Street Church, and we'll hear more about him later because he performed admirably in the war. Let's go back to the map. September 18, 1775. They're on their ships. They're leaving the harbor. The reason there's a discrepancy, I believe, between 10 or 11 ships is that one ship got stuck on the bar going out of the harbor. We all know it's a very treacherous and very difficult harbor to this day to be able to navigate. And sure enough, the Swallow, they were all ships, by the way, owned by Patrick Tracy, who became very good friends with Benedict Arnold. And the Swallow was got caught, had to wait for a high tide or two to finally catch up and follow the rest of the fleet. The fleet made it up to Port Richmond at the mouth of the Kennebec River in Maine. And their first significant stop, I'm going to pick out the half a dozen places that were fairly significant and well written about, was on September 22nd at what is today known as the Arnold Expedition Historical Society. At that time it was the Reuben Colbert Farm near Gardner, Maine. Now, Reuben Colbert was also down in Cambridge right after the Battle of Bunker Hill. He met with George Washington, and George Washington charged him with building 225 boats in the space of about a month, maybe a month and a half. Just an amazing feat. He did it all at this farm. That farm is open to the public. If you're going to follow this route the way we did, that's a great place to stop. It took the troops 4 days to get there. We're lucky. It took us 2 hours. So just go up 95 and up to the Kennebec River and the Gardner, Maine, and stop at Reuben Colbert's farm and check out where they built 225 ships. As you would expect, when you're kind of faced with, can you build 225 ships in about 30 to 40 days? They weren't all built that well. And they were built from green wood, which wasn't very helpful as they had to paddle upriver for the next month or two. So that figured prominently on how significant this expedition, or this kind of significant problems that the expedition was going to have. There was also a big debate with Washington and Colburn and Arnold and Schuyler, and that was, do we build canoes or do we build these things called bateaus? And these are examples of bateaus. When you go through this route that we went through, all along the way there are little monuments as well as recreations of the bateaus that have been built throughout the years. And you can see my wife standing next to one that was up in Lake Megantic in Canada. These bateaus were made to hold basically 2 to 3 soldiers in the boat with supplies. 2 to 3 soldiers would walk along the boat, along the shore. And they trade off as they went along. And Colburn, who made these 200 some odd boats or bateaus, he made a claim of charged the Revolutionary War government with 500 pounds of expenses. He got 16. He died penniless in 1818. Not an unfamiliar story, because that's exactly what happened with Patrick Tracy when he devoted his whole fleet to supporting the war effort and the fleet that helped get these soldiers up to the Kennebec River and later became privateers during the Revolutionary War. He died penniless on the Spencer Pierce Little Farm because Congress would refuse to reimburse his expenses. So that's what happened. But the next stop after the Colburn Farm, or after they had the Colburn Farm and the building the bateaus, is in Augusta, Maine, at Old Fort Western. 5 days into their trip, At Fort Western, that's where Private Aaron Burr met Jacataqua, a Native American princess who was going to help the troops guide their way through the Maine wilderness. She was purported to be a beautiful princess of the Abenaki tribe. I think reading the documentation and what's between the lines, there was a pretty darn close relationship with Aaron Burr, young, 19s, and Jacataqua, and she lasted throughout most of the expedition. Interesting because the natives couldn't be trusted. The Native Americans at the time allied themselves with the French Canadians and were being converted to Catholicism. And as we know, Catholicism and our religion down here didn't quite mix very well. So there was a lot of distrust, and rightly so, because the Native Americans were known to kind of work with the Arnolds and the troops, and then run up and tell the British what was going on, and they had to be careful about how much they could share with them. The other thing to keep in mind is Old Fort Western was built in 1754, and there's an example of it today on the banks of the Quebec River. Context, 1756 was when Old South Church here in Newburyport was built. The French and Indian War ended in 1763, and Quebec City was conquered by the British in a battle on the Plains of Abraham, just outside the walls of Quebec City, and that was done in 1759. So it was all in that period of time that we were building at the British, and then the young American colony would have forts on the Quebec that reflected where the frontier was with the Native Americans. It's a beautiful city. It's open to the public. It's right in downtown Augusta, which kind of makes it even more interesting because you can see all the buildings that are in downtown Augusta. They got the block houses on the corner. That particular building there was actually converted into, over years, a factory and then a boarding house. But it's only in the mid 1900s, 1950, 1960, that they made this into a park and recreated Old Fort Western. That definitely a wonderful place to stop on the way. Old Fort Western was also the place where the first casualty of that war took place. And let's hear from Caleb Haskell. Caleb wrote on Sunday, September 24th, last night a man was shot by another that belongs to the detachment. The wounded man died. And for more detail, we hear from the diary of Major Return Jonathan Meggs from Middletown, Connecticut. One of the things that struck me about this, is anybody familiar with that title, Major Return? I haven't heard, Major General, things like that. No? Major Return? Major Return? Yeah, that's because there is no title of Major Return. He was a major. His name was Return. Now that was very odd, right? And the family story of Major Return Jonathan Meggs was that his father was who was going out with a young lady in Connecticut at the time, decided that he was going to leave her, and as he was going away on his horse, the father, also named Jonathan, his future wife came out and said, "Return, Jonathan, return!" He came back, the rest is history. First child, they named Return Jonathan. Now, that's the family story. As historians have dug into that family story, they said, not so fast. First of all, his father wasn't named Jonathan, it was named Jonah. And second of all, that particular family had an interesting history of unusual names for their children, like Concurrence Meggs, Minefield Meggs, Recompense Meggs, and the twins, Silence and Submit. And there's Thankful Meggs, Mercy Meggs, Wait Still Meggs, and Church Meggs.
So maybe they were just being another creative name in the Meigs family, return Meigs. But or maybe the story of love in an early stage was true, and she really did say, "Return, Jonathan," and named their first child Return Jonathan. And while Major Return Jonathan said, a number of soldiers being in the private house produced a quarrel, and Will McCormick, being turned out of the house, immediately discharged his gun into the house and shot a man through his body, of which he soon expired. McCormick was tried by court-martial and received the sentence of death. Again, I think our forefathers here in the Newbury Port area were very wise not to mix soldiers with booze, because that's exactly what was happening up at the fort, and these were the consequences. McCormick, even though Arnold had a makeshift trial at the time and sentenced him to death, on second thought, he said, let's send him down to Washington, and Cambridge let him deal with it. McCormick went down to Washington. He was tried against there, and I don't think that he actually was executed for what he did, but he certainly was jailed. And yeah, that's soldiers and booze. They don't mix. The Swallow, remember the Swallow? That was the ship that was hung up on the bar. It had finally caught up at Fort Western, and it was charged with bringing McCormick back down to Newburyport. And in that return trip to Newburyport, Benedict Arnold wrote this letter to Nathaniel Tracy. I must embrace this opportunity to acknowledge the many favors received by you at Newbury, and am, with my best respects to Mr. Tracy, your brother, and Mr. Jackson. It's kind of touching, because Benedict Arnold wasn't a traitor yet. He was an up-and-coming, well-regarded soldier, very helpful during the Revolution. And I neglected to mention, there's a table just outside the door. I put some books on display. They're not for sale, so please don't take them. And there's also a leaflet there that will give you a website or QR code that gets to all the research that I did on this presentation. And you can read more about, one of the books is about Benedict Arnold's Navy and what he did in the Lake Champlain Valley, as well as a book of photographs, all known photographs of Revolutionary War veterans, and I highlighted the ones from Newbury and Newburyport. So, up the Kennebec we go, and we leave Fort Western in Augusta. We go by car, current day, and end up near Waterville, Maine. Waterville, which is the home of Fort Halifax. You can do this in a day trip, by the way, so it isn't that far away, at least up to Fort Halifax. Anything beyond that could get kind of tricky. You might have to stay overnight. But let's hear from Caleb Haskell and his diary. And, oh, by the way, Caleb, I consider one of the best diaries of the war, because he was short and sweet. He did not mince words. Usually it's a day would have a sentence or two. And part of it was, a lot of the other diaries were written after the fact. They came home, they thought about what they did, they kind of made up the dates and times and events in retrospect. Caleb was writing this day of. So you can imagine him in a candle in his tent, out in the open, just getting the words out as soon as he could. So these are like newspaper reports from the field. And Friday, September 29th, this morning, I set out by land, traveled 4 miles to Fort Halifax. Saturday, September 30th, we set out in a bateau. We had a tedious time today on passing the 5 Mile Falls. Now we are learning to be soldiers. So at night we camped at Winslow. You can tell it was starting to get rough. This was getting real for the soldiers. Up till now, it was a party. Now it's getting serious. And if you go up to Fort Halifax in Waterville, you'll see this. It's the oldest surviving blockhouse in the United States of America, built in 1754. There's still, as soldiers and visitors were wont to do, initials inscribed. I think it's hard to see on this one. Yes, somebody wrote their initials in 1876, but it's all over the wood on that building. It's a beautiful park and a beautiful city. You can just picture how they would take those 200 some odd bateaus and bring up to the shoreline and just camp out in the area there. We are now what the soldiers were at the time, 11 days into their journey. We were a half hour from Fort Western. So it took 6 days for them to get from Fort Western to Fort Halifax. And at Fort Halifax, just above the river, was the first waterfalls. The 5 Mile Falls that were referred to in the diary entry. Most of the falls now are dammed, so you're not going to get the full picture, but you kind of get an idea of what the rocks look like and how difficult it would have been to go upstream with all the ships that they had. They had more than a few of them to encounter. Let's read from Dr. Isaac Centers. He was the company doctor from Londonderry, New Hampshire. During all this time, bateaux were coming up and going over the falls. These falls are called the Taconic. Several of our bateaux began to leak profusely. Wow, the wood was green. What do you expect? Been made of green pine, and that in the most slight manner. My bateau had arrived at the fort in such a shattered condition that I was obliged to purchase another. So they were even going along, not only purchasing boats, but maybe stealing them where they could find them, where Native Americans had left them. But they did what they had to do to get upstream to attack Quebec. If you travel there, there's this cute little bridge called the Taconic 2-cent Bridge. In that area of the river, there were factories built on both sides of the river because of the falls, and to get the factory workers to be able to get between the two factory buildings, they built this really small, slender bridge, which still stands today, and it's definitely worth the walk across the Quebec River. The Taconic 2-cent Bridge. I guess because it probably cost 2 cents, those factory owners. You know, they would make a buck whatever way they can. They would probably charge the workers 2 cents to go across between the factories. So now we come up, after we leave Waterville and Fort Halifax, we come up to Skowhegan. How many folks have been to Skowhegan? Okay, there's a few of us. And Norwidgewock near Skowhegan. The troops at this point were 15 days into their journey, and 4 days from Fort Western, 3-minute ride for us. So it's pretty easily done in our modern day cars. The Norwegian story is very interesting, and this is where we come into Esther Wheelwright. Remember Esther? I really think Esther was a driving force behind Jeremiah Wheelwright going on this expedition as a civilian, because I believe he wanted to find and meet with Aunt Esther once he got to Quebec. Captain Henry Dearborn was from Hampton, settled in Nottingham, New Hampshire. Except for 2 bad falls, the land on the north side of the river is very good, where there are 2 or 3 families settled at Norwidgewock. Is to be seen the ruins of an Indian town, also a fort, and a chapel. Norwidgewock was an Indian community, and the tie to Wheelwright was through a fellow named Father Sebastian Rail and Father Bigot. These were priests sent by the French Canadians before the British won the battle to convert Native Americans. Father Rail was called, his nickname was the Black Robe, or the Apostle of the Abenaki. When Esther Wheelwright was kidnapped from Maine, and remember at this time Maine was really part of Massachusetts, she was held here at Norwidgewock by the Native Americans. And Esther was discovered by Father Rail and he appreciated this little white girl that was living among the natives by that time, a few years, and decided to take her back up to Canada, where she became adopted by the governor of Quebec and lived her life in Canada. And we'll hear more about that as we go along. Norwich Rock eventually, in 1724, was invaded by the Americans. We were still British at that point. There was 208 soldiers against 160 Abenaki. And Rail was shot going for his gun. It was mutilated. His scalp was redeemed in Boston with those of the other dead. So a fairly significant place for our history and our relationship with the Native Americans. So we can continue our trek. And there were times where you can, the river being dammed, it wasn't that fast, the Kennebec River in these parts, up past Moscow, and eventually to Karatuk, where they decided to take a shortcut. See this section here, you can see it, oh, did I get this right? Not quite working. Oh, there it goes. You can see it go around. That's actually the river as it still exists today. For those of you that are into whitewater rafting, that's a very popular whitewater rafting spot, the Forks, in the upper Kennebec. And then over here is the Dead River that goes into Flagstaff Lake. They decided that the river was going to be running too fast and be too hairy to go around that loop, so they cut across. They cut across, taking advantage of these 2 or 3 lakes to get to the Dead River at that point. And that was they considered that a shortcut. They would unload their boats. This is a little etching that was done of the unloading, and this 20 days into the trip. They also started stockpiling food here and setting up a hospital for men that were getting sick from the trip. This was called the Great Carrying Place because they had to carry all their equipment across the land. Caleb Haskell, October 12th, Thursday, took our boats, loading on our backs, carried them about 4 miles, rough walking, no path, built a blockhouse to leave our sick. It was starting to get tough. You know, they were encountering rough water, uncharted territory. So it wasn't easy at this point, but still doable. And today, if you want to do it, the Mainers out there have actually created a trail. It's called the Great Carrying Place Portage Trail. And you can actually get off at Route 201 on the Kennebec River, just below Karatuk. And a very well-marked trail, very worn, and follow what they want across. It's even said that it's still digging up artifacts from that expedition. Although what they would do is hike the trail and then take the boats across the lakes, and then get back on the trail again. So the Great Carrying Place Portage Trail is definitely a place to visit as you follow along on this journey. That takes you to, by the way, what happened at the Great Carrying Place Portage Trail was Mr. Sprague, James Belvin's diary entry, on October 10th, our chaplain went to prayers, and we went to the first pond 4 miles from the river. It blew hard, the second casualty of the expedition. One of the men was killed by a falling tree. It could have been a tree that he was in the process of cutting. It could have been high winds, or somebody else was cutting a tree and this guy got in the way. But that was the second casualty. And the Reverend Spring still figures prominently. By the way, Reverend Spring's portrait stands today in the church on the Congregational Church, the Center Congregational Church on Tecum Street. And we're trying to raise money to restore that and have it exhibited in the Custom House Maritime Museum next year as a commemoration of this whole event. Because Spring was a big man, over 6'4", 6'6", and he also had a significant piece of the action when we actually attacked Quebec City. Back in those days, there was no Flagstaff Lake. It was called the Dead River. So every place you see the lake here, it actually was a river that was fairly fast running towards the upper end of it. And that's what they followed. Once they trekked across land here, they went back onto the river and followed the river through this section. It takes about, that whole section here, it takes about 30 minutes by car. It took them 16 days. Part of it was they were getting tired, they were getting slow, they were losing their place, and they were 35 days into the trip. There's also the scenic part of this trip, if you decide to do what we did. That's the Carabessa Valley, and that's the Bigelow Mountains in the Carabessa Valley. Let's hear from Caleb Haskell, what he's had to say about what was happening at that point. Monday, October 23rd, took the wrong branch of the river, went 4 miles out of the way, had to go back again. You could just hear the frustration of what was going on, and an ominous, our provisions grow short. So they were starting to get into deep trouble. But as for us, we were having the time of our lives. We had the tents out, we had the kayaks out, just a wonderful place. The fire at night. It's the Carabassa Valley is a great place to visit for Flagstaff Lake, a wonderful lake to paddle. And as you can see me sitting there at our campsite, when I turned around, that's the view we had, the Bigelow Mountains. The Bigelow Mountains weren't called the Bigelow Mountains back then. It was the first time that the expedition had seen them. And Major Timothy Bigelow from Worcester, who was part of the expedition, actually climbed the Bigelow Mountains to see where the heck they were going and see what was in the future for them. Again, probably a sense of frustration and getting worried about the trip. If the morning view of the Bigelow Mountains looks something like that. Just a wonderful, beautiful area of Flagstaff Lake and Carabassa Valley. They were 32 days into the trip. They thought they would have been here in 2 weeks. And that's our campsite, almost the exact spot where Caleb had talked about taking a wrong turn on a side river. But it's also the spot, and this is get a sense of the betrayal and the concern that was going on. Colonel Roger Enos's company decided they needed to turn back. They were done with this. And now, he took a vote of his officers, to Enos's credit, Roger Enos from Connecticut, and it was a tie. He broke the tie, and voted in favor of going forward. Except, later in the day, I'm sure a lot of discussion going on, he said, listen, I know I voted to go forward, I broke the tie, but these guys aren't going to go, so I'm going to go back with them. And they turned around. Not only did they turn around and take a significant portion of the men with them, like 200, 300, 400 men, they also took more than their share of supplies. Benedict Arnold had been sending letters all along, bring the supplies up, bring the supplies up. And what they decided was, we think you guys are going to have to figure out what you need to do. We need that food to make it back. And they took more than half of the remaining supplies back with them. Colonel Roger Enos, after the war, or after during the war, after the expedition, was court-martialed in Cambridge. He was not convicted, but in the court of public opinion, he was. And nobody liked him at that point. They just felt he was a traitor, and he turned his back on this expedition. He had to move to Vermont. It was Ethan Allen, a friend of his, that took him under his wing And in fact, today he's buried in the Ethan Allen Family Cemetery. So it's an interesting point and a significant point in this expedition where they basically lost a significant part of their troops. As you progress, if you follow this trip along like we did, every 2 or 3 miles there's another plaque. I have to tell you, people up in Maine, especially as you get up into the Caribbean Valley, really appreciate what had happened. And you'll find rocks and plaques and wooden signs all along the way that you can read and describes the Benedict Arnold expedition to Quebec that took place in the valley. Above, as they started approaching the height of land, they would get more frequent, smaller falls, the chain of lakes, until they would get to that height of land. See if I can follow what here's the valley we're talking about, Flagstaff Lake, up through Eustis. That's Colburn Gap, which today is the place of the entry point between the U.S. and Canada. That area there was known at that time as the Great Carry. They expected to have to carry their boats over this height of land and into Canada. It's now known as the Terrible Carry, and that earlier carry is called the Great Carry. And the reason it's called the Terrible Carry is not only did they lose a significant amount of troops that turned back, and I believe possibly Jeremiah Wheelwright was part of that. They now were in an area that was quite swampy, and it was very hard to get through. So welcome to Canada. That's what it looks like today, and that's the Canadian border, pretty small. We're not talking like up there, Niagara Falls or any place like that. So it's a nice picturesque way to go into Canada. It took them 43 days at this point to get there. They expected to be there in 3 weeks. We leisurely took, with a couple of overnight camps, 2 days. So it's definitely doable. This is from the book Arundel. I don't have a copy of the book out here. I have a copy of the book that Kenneth Roberts, who wrote Arundel, which is kind of a fictionalized account of what happened during this expedition. He wrote that in the 1940s. And it's a topographic map of exactly what happened, because once the troops got there, they were tired, they were lost, they were trying to make their way through swamps. They got spread out all over the place. You can see where the writing was where men were found or died as they made it through. It was just miserable. And I say men. We know, in addition to Jacatqua, the Native American princess, who was also a guide, of 4 women, 2 that were confirmed, that were part of this expedition. One was the wife of Sergeant Greer. He was in Hendrick's company. She was noted as a large, virtuous, and respectable woman. The other was Jemima Warner, who was the wife of James Warner, who was a private in Smith's company. And James Warner was known to always be lagging. He was always the last guy. They're always kind of pushing him to move forward. These women having arrived, this is from one of the logs, it was presumed that all the party were up. We were on the point of entering the marsh when someone cried out, "Warner is not here." Another said he had sat down under a tree a few miles back. His wife begged us to wait with tears of affection in her eyes, ran back to her husband. We tarried an hour, they did not come. Warner watched her husband die under a tree, took a gun, joined the troops, and marched on. She was killed on December 11th during the siege from a stray bullet. In Private Henry's diary about Mrs. Greer, he said, "My mind was humbled yet astonished at the exertions of this good woman. Her clothes more than waist high. She waded before me to the firm ground. No one so long as she was known to us, dear and intimate, the disrespectful idea of her. Newbury's Caleb Haskell's diary tells us that she died April 18th, 1776, after we attacked Quebec City, but during the siege of Quebec City, by an accidental discharge of a gun. So, women were involved as well. It wasn't just men. This was the low point of the expedition, getting through the swamp, making it to Lake Megantic here in the upper corner of this map. Caleb Haskell, what he had to say about it, Sunday, October 29th, 6 miles downstream, very bad traveling to our knees in water. And others, I found them almost destitute of any eatable whatever except a few candles which were used for supper and breakfast the next morning by boiling them in water gruel. That was Dr. Center, October 24th. Here I saw some of the footmen were almost starved. This day Captain Goodrich's company killed my dog and another dog and ate them. I remained very unwell. Captain Dearborn, born November 1st, and Caleb Haskell wrote, ate part of the hind quarter of a dog for supper. We are in a pitiful condition. Yes, today it was the 7 Mile Stream. It's now named the Arnold River. And it was a Native American hunting ground. It's still swampy, still a hide of land, but also near Lake Megantic, which is where the troops made it to. Their first sign of human habitation was a bark hut on the side of Lake Megantic, built by the Native Americans, and it was a place for some respite in the middle of all this as they tried to make their way toward Quebec City. Lake Megantic also celebrates the Arnold Expedition. This is a sign dedicated in Lake Megantic to the expedition, and it's in French now, so it's all, rightly so, being French Canada, which was an important point. These are French Catholics. One of the reasons Washington was so excited about doing this, as was Arnold, was they thought that, the British had beat the French. The British were occupiers. As soon as we get there, the French Canadians will join us in revolt and will double our strength immediately. Quebec won't be able to be held. Not so fast. The British, the French hated the British, but guess what? They weren't exactly enthused about the Americans either. There was a strong cultural difference between the Americans and the French. The French were very cultured. One of the reasons why Esther Wheelwright never came back, living in French Canada, was almost like living in Europe. They had celebrations, they had castles. The Americans were viewed as kind of like, backcountry hicks. As far as they were concerned, the French would have nothing to do with us. It didn't help in terms of our ability to bring them over to our side, as we were now in Canada trying to invade Quebec City. Has anybody been to Lake Megantic? Have you heard, one person, have you heard about Lake Megantic? About 10 years ago, they were in the news. There was one of the worst railroad accidents in the North American continent at Lake Megantic. Somebody had put the brakes on a freight train at the top of a hill above Lake Megantic City, and overnight it started rolling down the hill, and at a curve in the center of town, it crashed and exploded. 74-car train, 47 people died in the middle of the night in their sleep. 30 buildings were destroyed, another 39 had to be demolished. And if you go there today, the remnants of that are still there. They're still trying to build out from what was just a terrible, terrible disaster at Lake Megantic. Once the troops got past Lake Megantic, they went down the Chaudière River, the cold river, because it was cold water, it was fast running, it wasn't dammed, and by the 1850s, these diaries of soldiers on this expedition were selling like hotcakes, including this diary by Ebenezer Wild on the banks of the Chaudière. And this was a big seller because he was so lucid and so descriptive and also so fake. There was never an Ebenezer Wild on the expedition, and somebody in the 1850s decided to make up a diary just so they could sell the books. And but interestingly enough, it kind of captured the spirit of what was happening down the Chaudière River. They would come down, their boats would crash, they hit the rocks. It was miserable. The river's a lot wider today. It's been dammed at spots, and it's not as wild as it was at their time. But they were still starving. They still needed food. Arnold went ahead. He kept going back and forth, trying to scout out ahead, come back to the troops. But we had no problem with food on our trip to New Orleans. This is a wonderful place to visit, particularly in what was then known as the town of Sardigan. Today it's known as St. George, and it's become kind of a mini tourist spot. It's also where Washington found a cattle farm, bought the cattle, and drove the cattle back up to the troops so that they could eat. And they had their first full meals from the cattle that Washington and some of the others had driven back towards the troop on the Chaudière River. Great place for lunch. Port David Roy in St. George, and you can enjoy the time there. They kept going down that river. 52 days later, 9 days from the border, they reached the last waterfall on the Chaudière River, just above the St. Lawrence Seaway. That was kind of the end of the significant part of their journey. Caleb Haskell writes about it. Saturday, November 11th, at Point Levi, in the afternoon, we were getting in readiness to cross the River St. Lawrence and making spears and ladders in order to scale the walls of the city. I find this just incredible. After everything that they've gone through, they get there and they're ready to attack. They are ready to attack. And they did try to attack. They tried to attack through the Plains of Abraham, which is the traditional way to attack Quebec City. And they didn't succeed. They had hoped. The Quebec City was manned by a very small contingent of British soldiers. They were waiting for springtime when the ice cleared to be able to resupply and bring more soldiers, because the city looked something like this. This is what our troops were probably looking at before they attacked the city. The wall, in particular, had to be scaled. And we kept attacking. We kept prodding. We kept trying to see, can we take this? And I think Arnold finally said, we got to wait for General Montgomery's troops to come up through Montreal. They took a little bit longer to get there, and they finally combined all the troops. Particularly, they were down to 400, 500 men from starting at 1,100 when they started. If you go to Quebec City, the Redcoats are still there. They're still marching around, and a wonderful city to visit and spend some time in. Including, here's the oldest, was purported to be the oldest house in Quebec City, a statue of Roosevelt at the entrance of one of the gates, and just cute little shops. We had a ball in Quebec City at the end of this our march to Quebec. Interestingly enough, they provide historical tours in Quebec City, and we kind of tagged along on one, and the tour guide described what he said was a cannonball from the war that still survives today and became part of a tree. So there's a cannonball from the Arnold expedition when the Americans tried to attack Quebec City, except that somebody that took me aside later says, nah, that's a parking lot marker. So a car would bump into it. Oh yeah, that makes more sense. So I was wondering how a cannonball would last that long in a spot like that. But yeah, so stories get made up about some of these historical events. Well, what I particularly liked visiting in Quebec City was the Ursuline Convent. And this is where we bring Esther Wheelwright back. Remember? Esther, Jeremiah Wheelwright's aunt, who had been kidnapped from Wells, Maine by Native Americans, held in Norwoodswocket, Maine, discovered by priests, brought back to Quebec City, adopted by the governor of Quebec, who had another 3 or 4 daughters. And what was tradition with the French Canadians to put the daughters in a convent, which he did with Esther Wheelwright. So now this Protestant woman from America, from Maine, Massachusetts at that time, was now found herself as the adopted daughter of the governor of Quebec City in the Ursuline Convent, the oldest school for women in North America. She did so well, and again, by this time, the family had known that she had been adopted. They kept pleading to have her sent back. The governor would not send her back. They would send gifts to the governor's family and then the convent to send her back. To this day, they still have a complete silver set that the Wheelwright family sent to the convent
to convince them to send Esther Wheelwright back. And that's part of the reason I think Jeremiah Wheelwright wanted to be on this expedition, was to actually encounter his aunt, who, no doubt, having some knowledge of the English language, would help with the translation and working with the American troops once they got there at the Ursuline Convent. Esther Wheelwright was this was no small feat to be to attend the convent. She liked it so much she became a nun, and she was Sister Marie Joseph L'Enfant de Jesus, Mother Superior of the Ursuline Convent, where she stayed in that role until her death. So it was not uncommon for American children to be kidnapped and decide to stay there, and she's a prime example of that. That portrait, by the way, stands in the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. Yeah, and so Jeremiah never got to see her, as far as I know. December 31st, 1775, they decide to attack. A blinding snowstorm. Montgomery from the south, Arnold from the north. Caleb Haskell writes about it. Caleb at this point did not participate because he had smallpox and was laid up in a hospital or makeshift hospital across the river, but he could hear what was going on and he was getting reports. January 1st, 1776, at 4 o'clock this morning, we perceived a hot engagement at the city by the blaze of the cannon and small arms, but could hear no report by reason of the wind and storm, and being a violent snowstorm. We found all my officers and 3 of my messmates and almost all the company taken or killed.
Caleb escaped being part of that. And to give you an example of what exactly was happening, Arnold was attacking the lower town with the gates to the upper town from the north of the St. Lawrence Seaway. General Montgomery was attacking from the south of the St. Lawrence Seaway. They were to meet here in the center once they breached the walls. The multiple stories about Montgomery, he was shot and killed. General Arnold was shot and had to be carried off the battlefield. Aaron Burr was one of the few survivors. Arnold was carried off by none other than the Reverend Samuel Spring. Being a big man, he had the wherewithal and the bulk to be able to carry men off the battlefield, and he helped carry General Arnold off. I like to tell the story, and this is a little subject to a little bit of embellishment, is that it was very, very, very close. If you look at the written record, they had Montgomery's troops and Arnold's troops had breached the walls. They were inside the city. It was hand-to-hand combat. In the case of Montgomery, he was shot in the head by a British soldier that was on the run. So you can just imagine they're gone, they've given up,
the war's over, we've captured Quebec. He turns around, takes a shot, gets Montgomery in the head. His soldiers see him fall. They fall back in panic. It was that close that we could have had the 14th colony, and we lost it. We pulled back. We decided that for the rest of the winter, we were going to try to starve them out and have them under siege. We could do that, we knew, until May, when British troops started reinforcing, and then everybody pulled back to Montreal. Caleb Haskell. Oh, wrong way. Good. And there are buildings, there are sites still in the city that you can visit. The seminary was the officers' prison. Enlisted men were also held in parts throughout the city, and they revolted. They tried to escape, and civilians treated like traitors and shot. We held on until April, May, and then Caleb Haskell wrote about it on his way back. Thursday, May 30th, traveled through Boxford and Bradford. About 12 o'clock, arrived in Newburyport. Found friends well. My remaining mystery, Jeremiah Wheelwright, all I could find in the record was that on January 18th, 1778, he died from the effects of the Quebec campaign. Now think about this. The campaign started in September 1775. The invasion happened in January 1st, 1776. So 2 years later, he dies from the effects of the Quebec campaign. My only guess is that he had wounds. He came back. I think he came back with as commissary with the Enos tribe, since the commissary was coming up the rear with Enos, but he either significantly sick or something, and whether it was smallpox or consumption or whatever, and eventually held on until he died in 1778. I haven't been able to find out where he's buried in any local cemeteries. I do know his wife is buried in Old Hill Cemetery in Newburyport. Just to kind of put this in context, I always love it. We have here in Newburyport a lot of construction going on where old houses are getting redone and totally gutted. And when things are pointed out, so you shouldn't tear down that house, or you should kind of respect some of the woodwork or whatever, people will tend to say, it's not historical, there's nobody famous here. Well, there could be, because if you start going through the genealogical record, you could find out a lot about the people that have lived in these old houses. Abraham, who lived in his house, went on to build and live in what is today known as Brigham Manor Nursing Home. He's buried in Oak Hill Cemetery. Jeremiah, his son, Jeremiah's grandson, was a sea captain who was lost off the coast of Maryland in 1830. His wife, who was left destitute, moved to Boston, ran a boarding home. Her son, George, became a famous publisher. He owns 3 mansions in Jamaica Plain in Boston. The whole family, this whole line right now, is buried in Oak Hill Cemetery here in town. That's how much they thought of Newbury and Newburyport. Edmund March Wheelwright became he was the son of Jeremiah. He became the son of George Wheelwright. He became the Boston City architect. Anybody ever travel over to Saltshaker Bridge? Edmund March designed that bridge. And then Joseph Wheelwright was a Jungian, lived in California, moved to California. He's a Jungian psychoanalyst. Anybody ever hear of the Gray-Wheelwright liner test? Probably not. Oh, you have. Oh, wow, good. You're the first person I've ever said in the audience that said, yeah. Today we know it as the Myers-Briggs. It was tweaked and taken over, and it's now the Myers-Briggs test. Joseph Wheelwright was at the inception of that. George Wheelwright, who started Polaroid? True, 50% true. Edwin Land was a student of George Wheelwright at MIT. Land was the marketer, Wheelwright was the brains. That's Wheelwright there, was the descendant of Edison, showing the invention of the Polaroid filter. That's Charles Edison, son of
Thomas Edison. He was Secretary of the Navy. So you can tell somebody who lived in one of these old houses, a descendant of somebody from Newbury or Newburyport, yeah, they've had an impact going down through the ages. So part of the reason why I'm up here telling you about it is not only do we have a big celebration in 1975, we're hoping to have one in 2025. Maybe it be 250 years, maybe it's not a 200th or 300th level celebration, but it's still a celebration. And we're hopes that we can pull this off. We'll have a ceremony at Old South, a procession to the water. Sherry is working on a plaque installation by the DAR. Do we know where that is going to be yet? No, still working on it. Yep. And maybe a Revolutionary War encampment. There we go. Probably in front of the Custom House Museum, an exhibit at the Custom House which would include Reverend Samuel Springs' portrait and his wife's portrait. Lectures, at least 3 or 4 lectures at the Museum of Old Newbury and at the Custom House, and hopefully we'll have a privateer ship replica in the harbor that will be open for tours and trips. So that's in the works. If anybody's interested in helping out, we can always use the help and the extra hands. Let me or Sherry know, and we'll get you involved. And finally, if you are interested in reading about this, not just listen to some guy on a stage, these are great books. Through a Holly Wilderness, Voices from a Wilderness Expedition, those are pretty recent, written in the last 10 years. Arundel, written in 1940. March to Quebec, which is on the front table here, is his notes and research notes that he used in terms of his writing of Arundel. And following their footsteps, I found this book after I did the trip, but Stephen Clark up in Maine, who was part of the Arnold Historical Society, did exactly the same thing and did an excellent job at writing up the steps and each place to stop along the way. So, and they're all available on Amazon. If you go to this website, you can take a picture of that, or you can use handouts on the back table with the website name. What I put on there is this presentation, a list of the complete roster of soldiers that went on the expedition, and then an extra roster of soldiers that were just Newbury or Newburyport related, and some reading references and the book references, and link to an Amazon book list should you decide to read the books yourself. And with that, I gotta tell you, we had a great time going up this trip. It was just so much fun. So if you get a chance, get in your car. You don't have to take a kayak or a bike. Go to Quebec City, have a great dinner, and follow in the footsteps of Benedict Arnold and the Quebec Expedition. Thank you very much. So, any questions? Thoughts? Yes, sir.
Abraham Millwright, he's the guy that built the railroad in Chile.
That is his nephew, William Wheelwright. Yeah, there's a bunch of Wheelwrights that live in town, and William Wheelwright, whose house was the old ladies' home up on High Street. And well, that's an interesting story. He was shipwrecked off of the coast of Argentina. And the way the family likes to tell it is, it was kind of rags to riches, shipwrecked, had nothing, lost everything, and then became a major industrialist in Chile. If you go to Valparaiso, Chile, in the center of town, there's a statue to William Wheelwright from Newburyport. But it isn't quite true. He still had a lot of money for it behind him, and family money. I have a home in London, a home in Newburyport, and a home in Valparaiso. But we still get people from Valparaiso, Chile, coming up to Newburyport to see where William Wheelwright was born. He was also he married Bartlett's daughter. So, Bartlett being one of the wealthiest people in the U.S. at the time. Yes?
1,100 that started out of that voyage, how many ended up in?
About 400. Yeah, about 400 ended up to attack. Yeah. And out of that, half of them were probably captured and imprisoned.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
And And so when did he become a trader after that?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think 1778, 1779. Yeah, yeah, in the Hudson Valley, he became. There's a lot that had happened after this. He was involved in a battle on Lake Champlain. And it was actually a sea battle on Lake Champlain. Successfully, we lost the battle, but we lost it in a way that we survived to fight again, which was a big accomplishment. And he was responsible for that, as was a fellow here from Newburyport, Edward Wigglesworth, was involved in that battle. And he's considered, I've heard say that he's the hero of Valcour Island. It was the Battle of Valcour Island. And then Benedict Arnold became in charge of Philadelphia at the time. That's when we were occupying Philadelphia. We were in Philadelphia before we gave it up to the British. But there's a lot of things that he felt he just wasn't getting credit for. And then they weren't giving him promotions, they weren't giving him pay. Bitterness swept in. They gave him the command at West Point, and he was in the middle of a plan to turn West Point over to the British when he was discovered, and lived the rest of his life in London.
Was he hanged as a trader?
No, he wasn't hanged. He went over to the other side, became an officer in the London British Army, but they never really used him. Just didn't get any respect from anybody anymore. So, rightly so. But up until then, yeah, he was on our side. He was all in. Yes. Any other questions?
So how did the survivors make their way back to Newburyport?
That's an interesting story. Some of them, like Caleb Haskell, they kind of came back through Vermont and just walked back, or got rides where they could. Some of them were able to get ships in the St. Lawrence Seaway and come back around. And that was part of it. The British knew we were coming, but they thought we were going to attack Newfoundland or Nova Scotia, because that's where they have forts, and we're a maritime country, and everybody did things by ship. They had no idea we were going to come up by land and try to attack Quebec City. So they were preparing for an attack up there.
So it wasn't organized, it was just...
No, it wasn't much of an organization to get everybody back. And remember also at that time, when you signed up for to fight, you were signing up for 1 year. So this is true with Abraham. We went down to Washington and across the Delaware to Washington. After that battle, they asked him to stay 3 more months because they were begging for men to stay on. His 1 year was up. He came back. Now, to his credit, it's true for many patriots during the Revolution. The 1 year enlisted was up for land battles, but particularly at Newburyport, we immediately got on our ships and started being privateers, which was much more lucrative, because if you captured a British ship, you got to keep some of it. And in the case of Abraham, he got some really good knowledge of how to trade with the Caribbean, and built that into a business after the Revolution. Made a lot of money that way.
I have a question.
Go and then we'll...
Is there a record of those who actually returned to Newburyport?
Yes, there is. It's in one of the books, The Voices of the Wilderness. He's got a complete list, and in fact, the list, that website you go to, I think on the list of Newburyporters, it says whether returned, captured, killed. So, that's, people are constantly looking at that again. There's a discrepancy. The monument at Upper Green says 26 men. The recent scholarship says, no, it's more like 29. And that number doesn't include Jeremiah, because he wasn't considered from Newbury. He was considered, he had married a woman from Gloucester, and he was born in Portsmouth. So, and besides, he wasn't even part of the military. He was just tagging along as far as they were concerned. Yes, over here.
Oh, so my question was, you had to sign up for a year,
Yeah.
right? Now, was it a voluntary, or were they paid? Was it all volunteer stuff?
Yeah, well, they were supposed to be paid.
Yeah, whether they got paid or not.
How much were they paid?
Well, I don't know. I couldn't, yeah, good question. I don't know. But, yeah, but it was only a year. That's I found that surprising. They were only asked to join for a year, and that was I think that was part of the deal. I mean, you're talking farmers, merchants, right? They didn't really want to leave their lives, but just, okay, I can give a year to this and go back. And many of them, like Abraham, said, no, he was a privateer until 1783, until the end of the war.
So I do have an idea of a project that's actually suggested by Jack, that we try to identify the descendants of the settlers who were part of the expedition. So I do have some lists of names, and if there are people who are interested in participating in this genealogical project, I'd love to hear from you, and we can see if we can figure that out.
That would be awesome. And then you can all get together and take the car ride.
A top tour.
Okay, thank you very much.